to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. Today we continue in 1 Chronicles with chapter 8. Benjamin fathered Bela his firstborn, Ashbel the second, Aharah the third, Noha the fourth, and Rapha the fifth. And Bela had sons, Adar, Gera, Abihud, Abishua, Naaman, Ahoah, Gera, Shephuphan, and Huram. These are the sons of Ehud. And they were heads of fathers' houses of the inhabitants of Geba, and they were carried into exile to Menahath. Naaman, Ahijah, and Gera, that is Heglam, who fathered Uzzah and Ahihud. And Shaharaim fathered sons in the country of Moab after he had sent away Hushim and Beerah his wives. And he fathered sons by Hodesh his wife, Jobab, Zabiah, Mesha, Malcolm, Juz, Sakiah, and Mirma. These were his sons, heads of fathers' houses. He also fathered sons by Hushim, Abitu, and Elpaal. The sons of Elpaal, Aber, Misham, and Shemed, who built Ono and Lod with its towns. And Beriah and Shema, they were heads of fathers' houses of the inhabitants of Aijalon, who caused the inhabitants of Gath to flee. And Ahio, Shashak, and Jeremoth. Zebediah, Arid, Ader, Michael, Ishpa, and Joha were sons of Beriah. Zebediah, Meshullam, Hizki, Heber, Ishmerai, Islai, and Jobab were the sons of Elpaal. Jakim, Zikri, Zabdi, Elianai, Zilathai, Eliel, Edea, Bereah, and Shimrath were the sons of Shimei. Ishpan, Aber, Eliel, Abdon, Zikri, Hanan, Hananiah, Elam, and Thothijah. Ifdeah and Penuel were the sons of Shashak. Shamsherai, Shehariah, Athaliah, Jereshiah, Elijah, and Zikri were the sons of Jeroham. These were the heads of fathers' houses according to their generations, chief men. These lived in Jerusalem. Jael, the father of Gibeon, lived in Gibeon, and the name of his wife was Maacah. His firstborn son, Abdon, then Zur, Kish, Baal, Nadab, Gedor, Ahio, Zechar, and Mikloth. He fathered Shemaiah. Now these also lived opposite their kinsmen in Jerusalem with their kinsmen. Ner was the father of Kish, Kish of Saul, Saul of Jonathan, Malchishua, Abinadab, and Eshbaal. And the son of Jonathan was Meribbaal, and Meribbaal was the father of Micah. And the sons of Micah, Pithon, Melech, Teriah, and Ahaz. Ahaz fathered Jehoiada, and Jehoiada fathered Alamath, Asmaveth, and Zimri. Zimri fathered Moza. Moza fathered Benaiah. Rapha was his son. Eliasa his son. Azel his son. Azel had 6 sons, and these are their names: Azrikam, Bokeru, Ishmael, Shariah, Obadiah, and Hanan. All these were the sons of Azael. The sons of Eshek his brother, Ulam his firstborn, Jush the second, and Eliphalet the third. The sons of Ulam were men who were mighty warriors, bowmen, having many sons and grandsons, 150. All these were Benjaminites. This is the word of the Lord. This is a wonderful text to, again, as you do genealogies, ask your kids what names sound familiar. Benjamin is the descendant of Jacob, Israel, that we've been talking about his descendants here, but there's going to be a few names that should stand out within this chapter. If you've studied the book of Judges, one of the judges made this list. In verse 6, the sons of Ehud, E-H-U-D, Ehud. He is the judge in Judges chapter 3. We'll come back to that in just a second. And then in the second paragraph, the big names are going to be Saul and Jonathan. So we'll come back to those as well here in just a moment. Saul being the first king over God's nation of Israel, and Jonathan his son, who is also good friends with the second king of Israel, David. So I don't want to skip over Ehud. Ehud is the judge over Israel who is a lefty, conceals his sword on the opposite hip than most people would. Left-handedness, not common in that era of history, really wasn't. I've never done a study to figure out why left-handedness has become more prominent today than it used to be, but it's a historical reality. Anyway, they would only check basically, I guess, the left leg, the left hip, for a weapon, because as a righty, that's where you'd reach across your body, you'd draw your sword from its sheath to fight. They didn't check the other. They had no need to. At least they thought they had no need to. And so as Eglon, king of Moab, had been oppressing God's people for 18 years, God eventually sends the judge, Ehud, to deliver. And he's going to go in, he's going to sneak in, basically under the ruse of having a special word from the Lord to give to Eglon. And Eglon wishes to hear it. So Eglon actually gives them privacy. It's just one-on-one. He's been checked, right? There's no weapon on that hip. So he's able, once the door is shut, to draw the sword from the other hip, and he stabs Eglon in the gut. And Eglon is described as being so fat that the sword was swallowed up within his fat. And so Ehud rescues God's people from Moab. That's an account that your children may know, they might appreciate. I think when I did that Judges text a while back, I encouraged even a little role-playing, especially for little boys that like to be energetic in the violent sort of way. Now, the next note there is that the sons of Ehud were heads of fathers' houses of Geba. Geba is the northernmost city in the land of Benjamin. It's less than 10 miles north of Jerusalem. Benjamin's not a tall tribe when it comes to their space in the Promised Land. They're spread out wider east to west than they are north to south. So Geba's the northmost, and we don't know anything really about this idea that they were carried into exile to Manahath. It's an unknown detail. Perhaps all the more intriguing about it is that Manahath appears to have been a village just a couple miles southwest of Jerusalem. So it's not like they were carried far into exile or by a foreign power. I mean, this is within their own people that such a disaster occurs. Then we get to verse 8, and we learn about a man named Shaharaim, who fathered sons in the country of Moab, which is again intriguing. So he's not in the Promised Land anymore. He's left it. He's gone east of the Jordan River. He's crossed the Jordan. So Moab is going to be really southeast of the Salt Sea. So if you look at the Salt Sea and the Jordan River above it, the group to the south that lived south of the Salt Sea was called Edom. And then if you're coming up around the eastern border of the Salt Sea, that's where you would find Moab, and then you would find Sihon and Og, the king of the Amorites, that were defeated in that place as well, before you would finally get to the Ammonites, I believe, that were above that. Also of note about Shaharaim is that he divorced 2 wives. He sent them away. That's what the idea of divorce in the Old Testament meant, was to send them away. And yet he had many sons of his own yet. So he had, in verse 9, 7 sons. And he also, by one of the wives he had divorced, had 2 more. So that's 9 in total. And then we end up following Elpaal, and one of his sons, Shimid, built 2 towns, Ono and Lod, or Lod. Those 2 cities are going to be near Joppa on the Mediterranean Sea. I guess they're not quite. Joppa's on the Mediterranean Sea. They're a little bit east from there. So they're in what we would actually call the land that was allotted to the tribe of Dan that they never actually possessed. And then in verse 13, Shema and Beriah caused the inhabitants of Gath to flee, Gath being a Philistine city. So they have somehow gotten an upper hand. Again, that's an account that is not provided for us here. Those are some of the names worth noting in that section. And that verse 28, then at the end, these lived in Jerusalem. Then we get the second paragraph today, starting in verse 29. Jael, the father of Gibeon. This is one of those. So Gibeon lived in Gibeon. Is Gibeon named Gibeon after Gibeon? You don't even know which way I said that. Is Gibeon the man named after the city in which he was born? Or is Gibeon the city named after the man because of what he did or who he was? In which case, then, it's called Gibeon here by the chronicler, because at his time, that's what it's called. Not possible to guess, really, from the text at hand. Well, not possible to do anything more than guess. What's going to be relevant, though, is that these also lived in Jerusalem and eventually are going to become the kingly line, very briefly. That's what we see in verse 33, that Kish is the father of Saul. Saul becomes the first king over Israel. That's 1 Samuel chapter 8. That's a prominent chapter. So I'm not saying Ehud of Judges 3 isn't worth knowing. The Judges, that period of Israel's history, it really is important. But Saul in 1 Samuel 8 is, I think it's fair to say, more important, where God's people rejected God as their king, and they demanded a man to be their king so they could be just like all the other nations around them. And so God gives them Saul. He warns them of the terrible things that the king will do to them, like taking their sons and making them fight in their wars and die, taking their daughters from them for various tasks, making them pay taxes, taking their land, all those sorts of things. And they say, okay, we want a king. Let us be just like everybody else. Ultimately, what becomes of that, by the way, is they do become just like everybody else. All the lands around them were pagan. They also become pagan, and they reject worshiping Yahweh. So not a good thing. Not good in the first place that they sought to cast off Yahweh as their king, but not good for their wicked desire of jealousy and envy of the nations around them either. So that's what we see with King Saul. Saul is going to be anointed by Samuel as king, and quickly after, really, David will be anointed to replace Saul, but not until Saul is removed from being king by God himself. We can be thankful that indeed God did send us a faithful king. You want to be king just like everybody else? Okay, God sent you a king, but God sent us a better king. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, God would make a promise to that second king, to King David, that he would have one of his descendants sit on his throne in Jerusalem forever, and that's a reference to Jesus. King David himself will say in the Psalms, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." That's sort of a picture. And this is good, that ultimately the kingdom is restored to the rightful king, to the one who created it in the first place, that it is returned to the Lord himself. So Saul's going to have Jonathan. Jonathan and David's friendship might be the strongest friendship attested to in Scripture, at least as we think of relationships, as we think of the friendships we know from the Bible. Probably be the first one people would mention. Jonathan is going to ultimately, just as his brothers do, die in battle against the Philistines, which you can find in 1 Samuel chapter 31. So Jonathan protects David. Jonathan sought to give David the opportunity to escape and flee his father's wrath and attempt to kill him. And David appreciated that friendship very greatly. Jonathan, however, is going to have a son. And his son, here in verse 34, is named Merib-Baal. In the book of 2 Samuel, he will be called instead Mephibosheth. Now, David had made a promise to Saul. He had made an oath before the Lord that he would protect Jonathan's family. He would care for his family tree. And so he's going to welcome Mephibosheth at his table, even though Mephibosheth is not always faithful to King David. Anyway, so Merib-Baal, hard to know exactly what it's referring to. Merib gets into the idea of contention, and Baal is a word in Hebrew for Lord or Master, but it's also the name of one of the false gods of the Old Testament, right? They worshipped a god named Baal, which is just Lord. So whether this is that he contended with the Lord, and we would think of Yahweh, or if he contended with Baal, the false god, it's harder to say again. But Mephibosheth, his other name, means end of shame. And so you can sort of see that in Mephibosheth, who is a cripple. I mean, he's lame in both of his feet, and yet he gets to eat at the king's table. And his family tree gets to go on anyway, despite the fact that his father and his uncles and his grandfather, being prominent men of Israel, were all killed in battle. He remains, and he gets to live on in David's kingdom. So his son is Micah, and that family tree continues from there. Eventually you get verse 40. The sons of Ulam were mighty warriors, 150 of them. So another recount of the might, the strength of God's people and various tribes. All these were Benjaminites. I'll just end today by encouraging you to think about and ask your kids, can you remember which man in the New Testament was a Benjaminite? One of them is named so very specifically. It's the Apostle Paul, who in his list of ways that he could boast, he's a Benjaminite, a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Pharisee among Pharisees, zealous after the church. And yet none of that mattered. What mattered was Christ's gift of salvation.